today we are very happy to have Tim Wachtman of the Plantscapes of New England with us. And Tim is a biologist by training and profession with over 25 years of experience as a research scientist and certification in secondary science education. He's a lifelong gardener and plant enthusiast, and he honed his skills in plant selection, design, pest, and disease control, and ecological gardening approaches as a manager for many years in the region's largest garden center. He continually expands his knowledge through research, attending science-based landscape and gardening conferences, and exploring botanic gardens and natural habitats in New England and throughout the country. His areas of expertise and special interests are ecological restoration and landscape design with native plants and indoor gardening with tropical plants, especially orchids. He also has an active event schedule, which he'll be showing you on his website, I'm sure. And he promotes ecological landscaping practices and environmental engagement to local residents. And with that, I will pass it over to Tim. Thank you so much for being here today, Tim.
Okay, thank you, Cassie. Thank you for hosting, and thank you to Westerly Library for sponsoring my talk tonight. I'm going to switch over to share my screen to the Plantscapes website. So I hope you all can see that okay. It's located at plantscapesne.com, and I packed this with a lot of resources that I hope you'll be interested in and find useful. And I'll just start by highlighting some of the upcoming Plantscapes events. So tonight we're doing Why Native Plants, which is the first part of a 3-part series that I'm doing with Westerly Library. In a week, I'm going to be talking about planting for pollinators. And then in the third part of the series, Enjoying Your Native Landscape, I will talk about a lot of ways that you can engage with a native landscape once you've started adding native plants to your backyard or whatever your situation is. And there's a lot of ways to a lot of opportunities for exploration and discovery once you have a native landscape in place. And I'll also mention that on June 21st, I'll be giving a presentation for Ledyard Library, which is going to talk about how to build out Doug Tallamy's idea for Homegrown National Park using pollinator pathways and a really powerful citizen science app called iNaturalist. And I'll talk about a couple of those things tonight, but at that presentation, I'll go into a lot greater detail about how to set up pollinator pathways and how to use iNaturalist. Okay, and then I'll also mention that at the bottom of the homepage, there's several tools and resources available. There's a trove of information on native plants, their selection, sourcing, how to design with them under tips. And for the purposes of tonight's presentation, if you click on notes, it'll bring up a list of presentations. Go to tonight's presentation, Why Native Plants, and if you click on notes, it will take you out to my speaker notes, which will have all of the websites, plant names, and books that I talk about. So you don't have to try and furiously write down, capture everything that I'm talking about tonight. Everything that I talk about is listed in these notes. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna go back out to my presentation. There are a lot of other things on that website too, so I encourage you to just poke around and explore. There's a lot of things to look at there, and I try and keep it as up to date as possible. Okay, so tonight is why native plants. And the first thing I will talk about is the definition of native plants. And depending on who you talk to, they'll have a different perspective on this. I use a historical and biological basis for the definition. So from the historical side, a native plant is a plant that has not been introduced by human activity. So it's indigenous to a local area. And from the biological side, native plants are plants that have an established ecological role in the local environment. So they've evolved along with all the other wildlife in that environment and have an important part to play in the functioning of those ecosystems. There's also the idea of near natives. So there are native plants that are, or plants that are not native to our region, but are native to areas that may adjoin our region, or the plants would do well and provide ecosystem functions if they are grown in our local area. So I'm going to make the argument that we can also make space in our landscapes for near natives as well as plants that are actually native to our own region. I'll give some rationales for doing that. And then I'm not a purist on the concept of native plants either. There are some exceptions to the native rule that I work with. And I can elaborate on that and give you some examples of that in the Q&A at the end if you'd like to go into that. Okay, so how do you determine if a given plant is considered native to your local area? In the background here, I have a Asclepias tuberosa, or a butterfly weed. And if you wanted to know whether that plant was native to your locale, the best way to do that is to utilize BONAP, which stands for the Biota of North America program. And this has been up for many years. It's the most comprehensive database on all the plants that are growing in North America. And once you know the species name for your plant, you can go into BONAP and find out where it grows. So the way these are color coded, so this butterfly weed is present in all the states where there's a dark green color. It's also present in all the counties that are colored in light green, and it's common in those counties. If it's colored yellow, the plant is present, but not at very high levels. And if it's orange, the plant was historically growing in that county, but it hasn't been observed there for a while. So this is a really great way of determining whether you're dealing with a native plant or a near native. It also lists those plants that are termed exotic or invasive. So there's a whole lot of valuable information here, but you do need to know the botanical name for the plant that you're interested in. And if you go out to your backyard or local woods and find a plant that you're interested in, the first hurdle that you have to get over is finding a name for that plant if you're not familiar with it. And the best tool that I'm aware of for doing that is a citizen science app called iNaturalist. And if you just take a picture of the plant on your smartphone, in very short order, all the iNaturalists out there will crowdsource your picture and help you to identify the plant. Usually just in a matter of seconds or minutes, there'll be an identification for it. And that identification will include the botanical name, which you can plug into Bone app, and then learn a lot more about the native range of that plant and find out whether it's something that belongs here, or whether it's something that might be exotic or invasive. Okay, so one of the issues around native plants are their opposite, which are the invasive plants. So invasive plants are plants that are not native, and they also are detrimental in some way, either to the local ecosystem, our economy, human health, perhaps. But they're plants that really don't serve a useful purpose here, and they often create a lot of serious problems. And one of the key problems is displacement, where invasive plants often grow very rapidly. They're very aggressive towards other plants, crowd them out, and they also disperse themselves widely. So they spread like crazy. And what that leads to is biodiversity loss, because the native plants may not be able to compete with the invasives for all the resources that they need to live and grow. The invasives also spread rapidly, and they're very difficult to control. So if we want to have landscapes that are predominantly filled with native plants, the invasives are a problem that we all have to deal with on a daily basis, or something that we have to think about and try to identify these plants and remove them when we do find them, because otherwise they'll take over. The unfortunate thing is that a lot of these plants were introduced through the nursery trade, and 3 of the worst offenders out there in terms of invasives are burning bush, bittersweet, and barberry. And depending on which state you live in, these plants are all listed on invasive species lists, but they're not always listed as prohibited plants, which means that nurseries and other sources can propagate and sell these invasives and continue to spread them throughout our landscapes. And some of these were brought in as ornamentals, like the Norway maple and the Japanese knotweed and bittersweet. They were all brought in to the nursery trade because they had characteristics that people were attracted to. But we found out over time that they cause a lot of problems, and they're very difficult to control. So if you go to a nursery and see any of these things, even if they are offered, please try to avoid them, because there are many, many issues with them. Some very good resources for learning what the invasive plants are in your area. In terms of the whole United States, there's an invasive plant atlas. At the state level, there's all the states have an invasive plant list, and those will also include prohibited plants that are illegal to grow or propagate or sell within the state. A very handy booklet that I've linked in the notes is Invasive Plants in Your Backyard. This is a really nice identification key to the most prominent invasive plants, and it also gives some information on how to control them. But the best source of information that I found out there is from Penn State. It lists a lot of information about the natural history of these invasives, but it also gives some really good information on how to control them and remove them from your landscape. So one of the pages that I have on the website is why it matters. And there's a lot of rationale for using native plants, but these are some of the key books and videos and articles that I found recently that make that argument. This David Attenborough video, A Life on Our Planet, if you haven't seen it, it's on Netflix, and I highly recommend checking that out, because it's a chronology over his lifetime of how much our ecosystems have changed. But it also is not just, there's a lot of positive information in it as well about what all of us can do to try and restore our ecosystems to better health. Okay, so my main thrust for encouraging the use of native plants is to support biodiversity. And so native plants are part of an ecosystem, and they're intimately tied through interactions with pollinators and other insects and birds as well. And Doug Tallamy has done a lot of the research to kind of flesh out these connections. And we know through Tallamy's work and others that if we value birds in the environment, then we're also going to have to value having caterpillars in our environment, because the birds rely on caterpillars overwhelmingly to support their young as they're in the breeding cycle. And those caterpillars in turn are dependent on the native plants as their food source. So all these things are tied together, and pollinators are also necessary for plants to get pollinated and produce seeds. And the birds are also necessary to help distribute those seeds throughout the environment. So all the components of the ecosystem need to work together. And the native plants are the key foundation for having all of the rest of the wildlife functioning in a healthy way. And over the last 100 years or so in particular, humans have been doing a lot of things to make it difficult for those native plants and for those ecosystems to function. And three of the main ones are listed here, with the most important being habitat destruction through things like agriculture and forestry and development. A lot of the native habitats have just disappeared due to that. Also, our overuse of pesticides has put a lot of pressure on the pollinators, and downstream from them, the birds as well. And finally, climate change is causing a lot of pressure and exacerbating these other problems as well. And it's happening so quickly that a lot of the wildlife, plants in particular, that can't just get up and move when conditions change, it's becoming very stressful for those populations. But there are a lot of things that all of us can do to help to counteract those destructive forces. And I've listed some of those here. And the first thing we can do is to kind of change our attitude to the kinds of landscapes that we value. In this picture here, this is a very beautiful home, but I refer to this as the Versailles syndrome, where the aesthetic, the goal of a landscape like this is to look out over a vast expanse of turf grass, punctuated by some meatballs and lollipops. But there's very little in this landscape that's going to be attractive to a pollinator or a bird. Now, there's no place, no habitat here for nesting. There's no, not a lot that pollinators are going to find useful in this environment. In contrast, if you focus on planting a layered landscape, focusing on native plants, and you can do this in a very small footprint. It doesn't require a large amount of land. You can put a lot of things in the landscape that are going to be very attractive to pollinators and birds. And if you have more land to work with, you can consider putting it in a meadow habitat with perhaps some forest and an edge environment, which is the most productive type of landscape in terms of biodiversity. So with that different kind of aesthetic in mind, the things that I encourage people to do are, to the largest extent possible, convert lawn to habitat, because the turf grass is by far the most costly and the least interesting and ecologically beneficial plant you can put in your environment. And converting lawn over to more productive habitat is the single most valuable thing you can do ecologically. Plant as many native species as possible. Again, here I'm not a purist. I'd love to visit nurseries and see the variety of plants that are out there. And I personally find it very difficult sometimes to resist choosing some of those plants that were selected for, highly interesting, highly ornamental characteristics. But the problem is that a lot of those plants that were selected to be most attractive to humans are not at all interesting or beneficial to pollinators and birds and other wildlife. Very importantly, we need to reduce the amount of pesticides and herbicides as well that we're dumping into our environment. Audubon has done a lot of work recently around neonicotinoids, and they're actually calling it the second silent spring, referring back to the problem with DDT in the early 70s. And there's a lot of science that's emerging now to say that the neonics are potentially at least as harmful now as what DDT was back then. So this is something that we need to be aware of and avoid putting these sort of insecticides into our environment. Another important factor that Talamy talks about, because he's got a focus on the role of insects, is light pollution that we add to the environment. And if you do want to put up security lighting or landscape lighting, please put it on a timer or on a motion sensor, because having those lights on at all times is very disruptive to insects, particularly moths, that do most of their activity at night. And having those lights on is very disruptive to their behaviors, and also causes a lot of predation on those insects that are being attracted to those lights. So I mentioned Doug Tallamy's name several times now. For the library audiences, I always like to point out a few books that might be useful. If you're interested in native plants and native landscapes, this is, in my opinion, one of the best books to start with. It's been out for quite a while now, but it's still very relevant. And Doug Tallamy, in a very inspirational way, makes all the arguments for including native plants in our landscapes and the many benefits that those can have, not just for insects and birds, but for our own quality of life. So this is a book that I recommend very highly. One of the other pieces that came out of Doug Tallamy's research was a collaboration with the National Wildlife Federation to produce this native plant finder. And the most valuable part of this website is helping us to learn what the keystone species are in our local ecosystem. So keystones are plants that have an outside role in supporting caterpillars and other wildlife in the environment. And all you do is plug in your zip code into the home page for this website, and it will take you to plant lists that are going to be most ecologically valuable for your zip code. And it breaks them out into trees and shrubs, as well as flowers and grasses. And if you look at some of these results, for example, a white oak tree will support around 500 different species of moths and butterflies, which means their caterpillars are going to use that tree as a major food source. So, and there's other trees listed as well, like cherry and willow, maple, that also have very high host potential for those caterpillars. And those are the kind of plant species that you want to think about first when you're deciding what to put in your environment, because they're going to give you the most ecological bang for your efforts and are going to be most beneficial to supporting a healthy ecosystem. And as you look through this, you'll find that some of the species will be supporting only a small number of butterflies and moths, and some will be producing or supporting a huge amount. And that goes for looking at flowers and grasses as well. Plants like goldenrod, while they don't support as many butterflies and moth species as what an oak tree would, they also provide a huge amount of nectar and pollen sources for bees, and also attract a lot of predatory beneficial insects. So having these keystone flowers and grasses in your landscape is also critically important. You can also use this website to look at the question from the other side. If there's a particular type of butterfly or moth that you want to attract into your environment, you can put that into the website and it will show you which plants are going to be most attracted to that species. And you'll also find as you're exploring this that some of the butterflies or moths may have only a single species that they're able to use as a host for their caterpillars. So including those specialist plants in your environment is also important if you want to have these a lot of biodiversity. So as you can tell, I'm a biologist, and plants and insects and birds are inherently interesting to me. And the major motivation for my interest in native plants is for the conservation and enhancement of biodiversity. But I understand that other people may not be as passionate about that aspect as I am, but there are a lot of other reasons to bring native plants into your environment. And in the next few slides, I'll go through some of those. So the first thing that I'll say is that putting predominantly native plants in your environment is going to allow you to need to use a lot fewer inputs to maintain your landscape. So if you're reducing your lawn, you're going to be doing a lot less mowing, which helps to reduce noise pollution and air pollution. And also turf grass, as I mentioned, is something that people often have to put a lot of pesticides and things into to keep it looking good. And those are things that we need to try and reduce now as much as we possibly can. Native landscapes also, once they're established, require a lot less weeding and watering. You can eliminate a lot of the inputs like dead mulches and insecticides and herbicides and fertilizers. A lot of times when you fertilize native plantings, it's actually detrimental to their growth. So they'll grow too large and become floppy. And some plants thrive on a poor soil. So fertilizing them often isn't necessary or even beneficial to them. So native plantings can reduce a lot of the time and expense that you put into your landscape. Also, from an aesthetic standpoint, there's a native plant that can fill any situation in your landscape because they've evolved over thousands of years to fill every available niche in our local ecosystems, wherever that might be. So for any situation, there's a whole palette of native plants that are useful to that situation, whether it be in a woodland environment or in your front or backyard. And it can be appropriate. They can be appropriately used in a more formal design setting or something that's very informal. Just putting a mini meadow or a large meadow into your landscape if that's what you desire. But the point here is that native plants in the right combination and the right location, I would argue, can be just as beautiful and provide a lot more dynamic interest to the landscape than what any of the exotic ornamentals could do. And I'll talk about this in much greater detail in my talk on enjoying your native landscape. But a few things that I would encourage you to do once you start putting native plants in is to visit your gardens often and do so at different times of the day, different times of the year, and just observe what's going on. Because as you plant these things, you're going to be attracting in a lot of wildlife that you've never seen before, of all sorts. And again, this will provide a lot of extra interest above and beyond the plants that you're putting in. Another thing that I encourage you to do is to certify your landscape. There are a lot of organizations that do this now, and those are linked in my speaker notes. And the advantage of this is it provides conservationists and ecologists and people that are interested in increasing native plantings. It helps to give an idea of how native landscapes are beginning to catch on and grow, which is very, very important. And a lot of these organizations also provide signage that you can get, so you can put them in your garden or at the roadside and give an indication to your neighbors and perhaps local officials that what you're doing is both intentional and beneficial, because that can be important for people around you to understand that you're not just letting your landscape go and you're not maintaining it. What you're doing is putting plants in that are very beneficial and that you put thought into it. As I said, as you plant these things, they will find it and they will come. So you're going to make a lot of new friends. And I encourage you to, as the wildlife starts to arrive, to learn their names, learn what they're feeding on, who's feeding on them, what their life cycles are. And it will be an endless source of exploration and discovery for you. And to me, that's really the biggest benefit of personally for a native landscape. As you're doing this, it helps to take notes. So you can do this in a spiral notebook if you like. The iNaturalist app that I mentioned is perfect for this as well. You can just take a picture and record what you're seeing, whether it's a new flower that's appeared or whether it's an insect or a bird that's appeared because of what you're planting. You can add notes as well. And the wonderful thing about that is that it becomes available to the scientific community as well. So your personal diary of your landscape also becomes useful to others. There's a whole library full of books out there on native plants and ecological landscaping. And once you get into that literature, it will just lead you in all sorts of interesting directions. So I encourage you to read widely on the topic. And finally, citizen science has become very important, where local amateurs and enthusiasts can hook up with a scientist that's interested in a particular project or problem, and together those amateurs and enthusiasts can provide a lot of data that conservationists and ecologists can use to protect and expand our native landscapes, and also to further ecological research. So that can be very important as well, and a very satisfying activity to get involved in. So I just want to conclude this part of the talk with emphasizing that when it comes to ecological landscapes, everyone has a role to play, and every contribution is important and counts. Because I think all of us have a goal of living on a sustainable, thriving planet, and supporting our native ecosystems are a very important contribution that we can make towards doing that. Okay, and in the next few slides, I'd like to get into some of the nuts and bolts of selecting native plants and sourcing them, because these can be provide some of the tricky issues and challenges in moving toward a native landscape. And the first thing that I'll say that the horticultural industry has picked up on the public's growing interest in native plants. So they're starting to satisfy that demand, which can be a very good thing, but we have to be careful because some of the things that they're putting out there are not necessarily very ecologically beneficial. As an example, red twig dogwood is an important native plant in our landscapes. But developers of new plant varieties have taken some of those native species and started selecting out traits that are really more attractive to humans than they are to the wildlife that would naturally utilize those plants. So rather than offering the species red twig dogwood, they've developed some cultivars that have interesting leaf characteristics, or they might be dwarf versions or have a different type of bloom. And those features that are attractive to us, like these puckered leaves, may make the plant very unattractive to some of the caterpillars that need to feed on that plant. So we just need to be aware that some of these interesting cultivars and hybrids that are coming out now with the native tag on them are, while they are a type of native plant, they may not be as beneficial as what the true species would be. Another example of that is this goldenrod cultivar. Goldenrod, as I mentioned, is one of the most valuable pollinator plants that we can put in our environment. The cultivars, though, or hybrids that are put out there, while they have attractive floral characteristics or the right size profile that we're looking for, this plant, that although it has lots of flowers on it, those flowers may not have the nectar or pollen quality that a pollinator is looking for, and they may totally ignore this planting that we put out for them. The other cautionary thing that I'll emphasize again is that the neonicotinoid and other systemic pesticides that are out there are still being widely used by the nursery industry. So please talk to your nursery person and find out whether there are pesticides in those plants, because very commonly there are. And the last thing you want to do if your goal is to attract pollinators to your landscape is to bring in plants that are going to be toxic to those pollinators. And there are some sources that I'll mention and on the website that are very careful about this and do not have pesticides in the products that they're offering. Another thing to think about as you're bringing these plants into your environment is putting the right plant in the right place. And so the things you want to think about are the soil conditions, the amount of light, moisture that's available, how big the plant's going to be, and what sort of function you want it to have in the environment. And there's lots of books out there that can help direct you on this to get the right plant in the right place. Also make use of your nursery person or landscape designer, especially if they have an interest and some expertise in native plants. A word about deer. One advantage of the native plants is that they've evolved with deer pressure. So many of them are inherently resistant. They produce chemicals that deer find distasteful. And so the deer will tend to ignore those plants. And also the plants have evolved to tolerate a fair amount of browsing by deer. So even if they're chewed on, they'll bounce back very quickly from that. Having said that, if deer are very hungry, they'll eat almost anything. And if you've gone out into the local woods lately, you'll see that there's almost no understory out there anymore. The deer have pretty much cleared everything out of the woods around here. So if you're planting trees, you will probably have to protect them for several years. There are tree shelters available now that will prevent the deer from browsing on them. Sometimes it takes plants several years too before they're established and are producing the resistance chemicals that the deer are going to be turned off on. So providing some protection for those trees and shrubs in particular can be important early on. Please don't encourage deer by feeding them. This really, I understand how there's a certain aesthetic interest in having deer in your backyard sometime, but feeding them and bringing them in is just exacerbating a lot of these problems. And also I know that culling the deer population through hunting can be a controversial topic. Population management has become an important issue just to keep our local ecosystems healthy, because just like the human population, the deer population is really way beyond what the environment can handle. And we really have to work at managing the deer population if we want to bring back and restore healthy ecosystems. As you dig into this literature more, one thing that you'll come across is ecotypes and ecoregions. Ecoregions are a development of the EPA where they've looked at different parts of the country and grouped areas with similar soil types and climate and such together, so that we can get an idea of where plant communities are most likely to thrive. And we're in ecoregion 59, the northeastern coastal region. So you can look for plants that are local to this ecoregion, and those will often be called ecotypes. So an ecotype is just a plant that grows within a particular ecoregion, and they'll often be seed offerings or plant lists that are targeted toward particular ecoregions. One other aspect of this is that there are adjoining ecoregions, like the mid-Atlantic coastal or perhaps the Midwestern ecoregions, that with climate change, a lot of these climatic conditions are changing so that plants that are native to the Mid-Atlantic region, as our temperatures warm, they're going to be more and more suitable for more northerly ecoregions like our own. So things are in flux, and they've always been in flux. Species always migrate, their ranges always contract and expand and move. Climate change is just driving that a lot more quickly than it's ever been done before. And one of the ideas that's out there is that we may have to help plants migrate a little and do it intentionally so that they don't get wiped out by climate change. And I'll just wrap up by mentioning a couple sources for native plants. I have a very extensive list on the website under the menu bar at the bottom. If you click on suppliers, it will take you to that list. Two that I want to highlight though are the Native Plant Trust. Native Plant Trust is an organization that's been around since 1900. They're the leading organization for the conservation and research on native plants in our region, and also to a growing extent throughout the US. But their headquarters are in Framingham, Mass, and they have a very nice bookstore and garden center there where they have a wide variety of native plants for sale. And they also have a farm out in Watley, which also has a nursery available there. So if you happen to be out in that region of Massachusetts or up near Framingham, near Boston, I encourage you to drop in. The Native Plant Trust in Framingham also has a botanical garden there called Garden in the Woods, which is a fabulous place to see our native plants in their natural environment. They've put a lot of thought into the plant combinations that they have there, and the topography of the location there is such that there's just all kinds of microclimates and different sorts of ecosystems going on there. So it's a wonderful place to get acquainted with native plants and get ideas about how to bring them into your own landscape. North Creek Nurseries is a plant grower that's been focusing on native plants for a long time. They do it very well. They are a wholesaler, but Plantscapes can help connect you with their plants if you desire. One thing that I really like about North Creek is they provide their plants, a lot of them in landscape plugs, which is the most economical and efficient way to get a lot of perennials out into your landscape. All right, so I'll end my presentation there, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Tim. We do have a couple in the chat, and if people do want to feel free to chime in, they can, but for now, I'll just read some out. Colleen S. was asking to begin with, she's looking for small native nut trees. Do you have anything to say on that?
Yep, so if you go to my supplier list, so the Native Plant Trust has a wide variety. I don't know exactly what you're looking for, but they have a plant list online so you can see what's available. And there are some other nurseries depending on where you're located, and you'll see those on the supplier list. You'll be able to tell where they are right away. And it's a growing concern to supply more native plants. So there's more companies that are providing native plants, and traditional nurseries are also expanding their supply. So you kind of have to hunt around a little bit. Certain landscapers and designers will also, that know native plants well, can help source things for you and find what you're looking for.
Great, thank you. Talking about nurseries too, she was also wondering why are they allowed to sell these invasive plants that you were speaking of?
Well, if they're on the prohibited plant list, and that varies from state to state, and it's a matter of enforcement as well, but they're legally not supposed to be selling those plants. And someone who goes around to a lot of nurseries all over New England, you will see the invasives there everywhere. And even plants that are on the prohibited list show up. So part of the problem is that those plants are sourced from all over the United States and sometimes Canada and elsewhere. And things come in that shouldn't come in. But our best defense against that is just to be an informed consumer. And also, if you see something that's in a nursery and shouldn't be there, mention it to the nursery person there. And eventually, if they're getting enough feedback, and people are aware of this, they may be more careful about the things that they're bringing in as well. And you also have to be, it's gotten a little bit complicated, but there are a lot of breeding efforts to try and take those invasive species and make them not invasive, or make them so they don't produce viable seed in theory. The problem is that nature always finds a way to survive and perpetuate itself. And there are many documented cases of plants that were designed to have their invasiveness removed, or their ability to set seed or whatever the mechanism is. There are documented cases of those plants reverting to invasiveness and then continuing to be a problem in the environment. So the safest approach is just to go with native species that, not hybrids, not cultivars, that are appropriate for our local region or have some rationale for being in our environment.
I just want to kind of add on to that, maybe sort of a plug that the Westerly Library, we do have the Master Gardeners come on, I believe it's Sundays. They're coming and they set up a kiosk in the park. They're going to be here on May 22nd, and you're welcome to come and ask them any questions that you want there as well. All righty. Well, I think with that, we're going to wrap up unless anyone has a last minute question for Tim. So thank you again, Tim. We appreciate it. And we will see you next week.
Okay. Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.